Socrates versus democracy. Imagine this. You're in ancient Athens, a noisy, sun-drenched city where people vote on everything, going to war, changing laws, even deciding who deserves to die. And right in the middle of it all stands Socrates, the wisest man in town, shaking his head and saying, "This is madness." Wait, what? Socrates, the father of philosophy, hated democracy. But isn't democracy supposed to be humanity's greatest invention? Well, not according to him. See, Socrates thought giving power to the people was like handing the keys of a sports car to a 5-year-old. You might think it's cute at first, until you see the crash coming. And here's where it gets wild. It was democracy itself that sentenced him to death. Yeah, the same system he warned about. Today, I'm going to tell you why Socrates believed democracy could be dangerous, and why, more than 2,000 years later, he might still have had a point. Let's rewind for a second. Athenian democracy is often portrayed like some golden age of freedom and wisdom, right? But the truth is, it was messy, loud, and chaotic. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a place where every citizen, and by citizen they meant adult males born in Athens, had the right to vote on absolutely everything. No politicians, no presidents, no elections every 4 years. It was a direct democracy. The people themselves decided on war, laws, taxes, punishments, even the death penalty. At first glance, that sounds amazing. Power to the people, equality, freedom. But Socrates saw a big problem hiding under that ideal. To him, the average person wasn't prepared to make such serious decisions. How can you decide about medicine if you're not a doctor? Or about justice if you've never studied law? He'd say things like, "Not everyone should have a voice in matters of importance just because they happen to be born somewhere." And then he'd throw in a brutal metaphor. If you wouldn't board a ship captained by a baker, why would you let someone with no clue steer an entire city? And you know what? He had a point. Athenian democracy wasn't guided by reason. It was ruled by emotion, popularity, and rhetoric. And here's the craziest part. Most public officials weren't even elected. They were chosen by lottery. Literally, a civic raffle. Imagine spinning a wheel to decide who becomes your Minister of Finance or your head of defense. Exactly. It sounds insane. To Socrates, it was insane. For him, ruling wasn't a game of luck or charm. It was an art, like medicine or navigation, something that required knowledge, discipline, and experience. He believed leadership should be earned through wisdom, not granted through chance. And that conviction made him one of the most annoying men in Athens. Because while everyone else was cheering about their freedom, Socrates was walking around poking holes in their logic. He'd stroll through the marketplace barefoot, stopping random citizens and asking uncomfortable questions. Do you know what justice really is? Are you sure you understand what truth means? And if they said yes, he'd smile, tilt his head, and keep asking until their confidence crumbled. Most people hated it. Politicians especially couldn't stand him. Because while they were busy giving emotional speeches and promising easy answers, Socrates was quietly exposing how little they actually knew. He didn't care about popularity. He cared about one thing: truth. And in a city obsessed with winning arguments and applause, truth wasn't exactly trending. That's where the conflict began. Socrates wasn't just a philosopher, he was a social disruptor. A kind of ancient whistleblower with nothing to lose. He didn't write books. He didn't give fancy lectures. He didn't have a podcast called The Socratic Hour. He talked directly to people. In the streets, in the gymnasiums, in the agora. And that, in Athens, was revolutionary. He used a strange but powerful technique called maieutic, the art of midwifing ideas. Instead of teaching people what to think, he helped them give birth to their own thoughts, by questioning them until they realized how little they really knew. For Socrates, knowledge didn't begin with answers. It began with doubt. That's what terrified the establishment and frustrated the crowd. Because who likes to be told that they do not actually know what they were talking about? But Socrates kept going. He kept asking, challenging, provoking, and little by little he became the most hated and the most feared thinker in Athens. The chaotic Athens. To really understand why Socrates almost lost his mind over democracy, you first have to picture what Athens was like back then. Forget the postcard image of calm marble temples and philosophers peacefully debating under olive trees. Athens was loud, crowded, emotional, like the ancient version of Twitter, but with togas. Citizens gathered every few days in the ecclesia, a massive open-air assembly where thousands of men would yell, argue, and vote by raising their hands. There were no microphones, no moderators, and definitely no fact-checkers. Everyone thought their opinion mattered equally, and technically it did. But as Socrates noticed, equality of opinion is not the same as equality of knowledge. The system was designed to give the people power, but what it really did was give power to the best talkers. The loudest voices always won. Sound familiar? The Athenians loved to hear themselves speak. Public speaking was the ultimate skill, the ancient equivalent of having 1 million followers, and that's where the sophists came in. These were the celebrity influencers of the ancient world, teachers of rhetoric who could train you to sound smart even when you were completely wrong. They didn't care about truth, they cared about persuasion. Their motto might as well have been, "Doesn't matter if it's true, as long as it goes viral." They taught politicians how to twist words, manipulate emotions, and make the crowd cheer. And the crowd loved it. So when Socrates came along saying, "Hey, maybe we should care about whether what we're saying actually makes sense," the sophists rolled their eyes. He was like that one guy in the comments who keeps asking for sources while everyone else is just sharing memes. Socrates absolutely despised the sophists. He believed they were poisoning the city with shallow thinking. Instead of teaching citizens how to reason, they taught them how to win arguments. And that, to him, was the beginning of the end. Because once the goal stops being finding truth and becomes sounding right, democracy turns into theater. For Socrates, democracy had stopped being a government. It had become a popularity contest. The most charming speakers, not the wisest thinkers, were the ones steering the ship. He compared it to being on a boat where the passengers take control because they outvote the captain. Sure, they might feel powerful, right until they crash into the rocks. Now, imagine the frustration. Everywhere Socrates went, he saw people voting on wars they didn't understand, laws they hadn't read, and punishments they hadn't thought through. Athens was a city obsessed with debate, but allergic to reflection, and when Socrates started pointing that out, people hated him for it. He'd walk through the agora, the public square buzzing with merchants, gossip, and politics, and interrupt conversations with questions like, "So you believe in justice? Great. But what is justice?" At first, people tried to answer confidently. Then, after a few more questions, they'd get tangled up in their own contradictions. Some walked away angry, others avoided him entirely. And a few, just a few, began to realize how fragile their beliefs were. That was exactly what Socrates wanted. He didn't want followers. He wanted thinkers. But in a society addicted to certainty, thinkers are dangerous. Now here's where things get even more ironic. Socrates didn't hate democracy because he loved tyranny. He hated it because he loved wisdom. He dreamed of a government ruled not by chance, but by competence, by people who actually knew what they were doing. He wanted leaders who sought truth, not applause. He wanted rulers who served, not performed. He imagined what he called the philosopher kings, wise, educated people, leading with reason and integrity, not with slogans and emotions. Sounds idealistic, right? Maybe even naive. But his point was brutally simple. Democracy without education becomes chaos, and Athens was living proof. The same people who voted for art, culture, and progress also voted to execute generals, start unnecessary wars, and banish their own heroes. Public opinion was a wild beast, impossible to predict, easy to manipulate. One day you're a national treasure, The next day, you're a traitor. Socrates saw this cycle again and again, and it terrified him. He believed that ignorance, dressed up as opinion, could destroy a civilization. To him, the danger of democracy wasn't that people had power. It was that they used it without understanding it. He warned that when emotion replaces thought, the crowd becomes the tyrant. And that's exactly what would one day happen to him. Because soon, the same democracy that celebrated free speech would vote to silence its most honest voice. Socrates, the street philosopher or the first troll. Let's be honest, Socrates wasn't your typical philosopher. He didn't write books, he didn't charge for lectures, and he definitely didn't sit in some marble hall surrounded by students taking notes. He was a wanderer, a barefoot old man with a sharp tongue and a brain that never stopped asking, why? If Athens had Reddit back then, Socrates would have been that one user who questions every post. The difference is, he did it in person. He went to the marketplace, to the wrestling schools, to the workshops. He talked to politicians, poets, craftsmen, soldiers, anyone who'd listen, or at least try to. And he had one superpower. He could turn your certainty into confusion in less than 5 minutes. He used a method now known as the Socratic method, or mutics, which literally means midwifery. Why midwifery? Because he believed that ideas, like babies, had to be brought out, not imposed. He wouldn't tell you what to think. He'd ask you questions until you discovered what you really believed, or realized you didn't actually know anything. It usually went something like this. So you think you know what justice is? Of course. Okay, then define it. Well, it's doing what's right. And what's right? Well, it's what's fair. And what's fair? At that point, most people just walked away, dizzy and frustrated. Socrates didn't do this to humiliate anyone. Though to be fair, it felt humiliating. He did it because he believed wisdom begins with realizing your ignorance. But in a city obsessed with certainty, that was a dangerous idea. Athens was full of self-proclaimed experts, poets who thought they knew about justice, generals who thought they knew about virtue, politicians who thought they knew everything. And here comes Socrates poking holes in everyone's logic. He was the ultimate debunker, the human version of a pop-up ad saying, "Are you sure?" People started calling him a gadfly, a tiny, annoying insect that keeps stinging the horse to make it move. And Socrates loved that metaphor. He believed Athens was a giant, lazy horse that needed to be stung awake. But not everyone appreciated his sting. Politicians began to see him as a threat. He made them look foolish in public, and worse, he inspired young people to question authority. To many, that was unforgivable. Socrates had a small circle of followers, curious young minds who loved to debate and watch him dismantle grown men's arguments like a surgeon with words. One of them was Plato, who would later become his most famous student. But there were others too, Alcibiades, Xenophon, young, ambitious Athenians who were fascinated by his fearlessness. Older citizens started whispering, "Socrates is corrupting the youth. He's teaching them to disrespect tradition. He doesn't believe in the gods." It didn't matter that none of it was true. The rumor stuck. And to be fair, Socrates did challenge everything, including religion. He didn't deny the gods outright, but he refused to accept myths blindly. He believed that virtue didn't come from rituals or sacrifices, but from understanding yourself. That kind of thinking was radical, even heretical, in a society built on tradition. He kept saying that true power comes from the soul, not from money, status, or popularity. And that the only real evil is ignorance. But try telling that to a politician whose entire career depends on keeping people ignorant. The more he spoke, the more enemies he made. For years, they tolerated him, the crazy old philosopher who just wouldn't shut up. But as Athens went through wars, defeats, and humiliation, people wanted someone to blame. And who better than the man who questioned everything, even the city itself? So they turned on him. The same democracy that allowed him to speak freely was about to use its freedom to silence him forever. By this point, Socrates had become a symbol. To some, he was a hero of truth, the last honest voice in a city drunk on its own ego. To others, he was a dangerous influence, undermining the very foundation of society. But Socrates didn't hide. He didn't beg for mercy. He kept talking, calmly, logically, relentlessly. And when the time came for him to face trial, he didn't change a word. He walked into that courtroom like he had walked through the agora, ready to question, ready to provoke, ready to die for what he believed. The trial that changed everything. By the time Socrates was an old man, everyone in Athens knew who he was. Not as a celebrity, but as a problem. He was that old voice in the crowd that wouldn't go away, always asking questions, always challenging assumptions, always making people uncomfortable. And in a city that prided itself on free speech, it's ironic how quickly they grew tired of him using it. The tension had been building for years. Athens had gone through devastating wars, political scandals, and humiliating defeats. The democracy that once felt unstoppable was now insecure, paranoid, and bitter. People wanted someone to blame for the city's moral decay. And who better than the man who told everyone they knew nothing? So, in 399 BCE, they put him on trial. The charges? Corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods of the city. But let's be honest, this wasn't really about religion or morals. It was about control. Socrates was too influential, too unpredictable, too free. And freedom, when it scares those in power, becomes a crime. The trial wasn't small. More than 500 citizens were selected, ordinary men, not judges or lawyers, to decide his fate. It was democracy in its purest form, the people sitting in judgment of their most inconvenient thinker. You can almost picture it, a crowded Athenian courtroom, voices buzzing, the heat of the midday sun, and in the center, an old man in simple clothes, standing calmly before the crowd. Most defendants begged for mercy, cried, brought their families to plead for them. Socrates did none of that. He stood tall and looked his judges in the eye. When they asked him to defend himself, he didn't apologize. He doubled down. He told the jury that he was doing Athens a favor, that his questioning kept the city alive, like a doctor who causes pain to heal the patient. He said that his mission came from the gods themselves, that he was commanded to make people think, and then he dropped the bomb. He told the jury that killing him would be a mistake they'd regret forever, that silencing the truth was far worse than any of his supposed crimes. Imagine the scene. You were standing in front of hundreds of angry citizens deciding whether you live or die, and instead of begging, you call them ignorant. That's how fearless he was. The crowd was torn. Some were outraged, others impressed. When the vote came, it was close, painfully close. By just a few dozen votes, Socrates was found guilty. Then came the second vote, his punishment. According to Athenian law, he could propose an alternative sentence, maybe exile or a fine. But Socrates, being Socrates, couldn't resist making one last point. He said that instead of punishing him, the city should reward him, give him free meals for life, like an Olympic champion, because he had spent his entire existence helping Athens find wisdom. It was the ultimate mic drop, and also the moment everyone in the room decided he had to die. The second vote was cast, death by hemlock. Even then, the city gave him an out. His friends begged him to escape. They had bribed the guards. The door was open, but he refused. He said running away would betray everything he had ever taught. He believed that obeying the law, even an unjust one, was part of his duty as a citizen. To flee would mean proving his enemies right, that philosophy was just talk with no moral backbone. So, he stayed. Plato later described the scene in heartbreaking detail. Socrates spent his final hours calmly talking to his friends about the soul, virtue, and the nature of death itself. He didn't cry, didn't curse, didn't even flinch. When the cup of poison was brought to him, he took it without hesitation. He looked at his friends, smiled, and said, "The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die, and you to live. Which is better, only the gods know." Then he drank. A few moments later, his body went still. The man who had devoted his life to making others think died quietly, surrounded by the very people he had taught to question everything. And here's the tragic irony. It wasn't a tyrant or a dictator who killed Socrates. It was the people. Democracy, the system he had spent his life warning about, had just proven his point. When the majority acts without wisdom, even justice becomes dangerous. When the crowd values comfort over truth, it will always choose silence over honesty. That day, Athens didn't just execute a man, it executed its conscience. In the years that followed, the city regretted it deeply. The same people who condemned him built statues in his honor. His students, especially Plato, would turn his life and death into the foundation of Western philosophy. Because sometimes, it takes killing the truth to realize how much you need it. The legacy. What Socrates warned us about Socrates died over 2,000 years ago, but his warning still echoes like thunder in a storm we haven't escaped. Because what killed him wasn't poison, it was ignorance dressed as opinion. And if you look around today, that poison is still everywhere. We scroll, we click, we argue, and we call it thinking. But Socrates would look at us and say, "You've confused noise with wisdom." He tried to tell us something simple. Democracy only works when citizens know how to think, not just what to think, but how. And that how is disappearing. Back then, the people of Athens voted on everything: war, taxes, even life and death, without really understanding what they were doing. Today, we do the same. Only now we call it social media. One viral post, one outrage clip, one emotional headline, and suddenly millions have an opinion. But very few have understanding. Socrates would have seen the danger instantly. He would have called it what it is: mass persuasion without reflection. Different tools, same trap. He warned that when truth becomes secondary to popularity, the crowd stops thinking and starts following. And that's how civilizations fall, not with bombs, but with slogans. Athens had the sophists. We have influencers, pundits, and politicians who master the same art. The art of sounding right, not being right. They know how to use emotion like a weapon, how to sell outrage like candy, how to turn thinking into entertainment. And we buy it every day because it's easier than thinking for ourselves. Socrates would have hated our echo chambers. He'd see how algorithms trap us in bubbles that only feed us what we already believe. He'd walk into a comment section and say, "Congratulations, you've built digital Athens, only dumber." He'd tell us that freedom without understanding isn't freedom at all. It's just chaos with better graphics. But here's the twist. Socrates wasn't anti-democracy. He was anti-complacency. He didn't want fewer voices. He wanted smarter ones. He believed that every person could become wise if they had the courage to doubt, to question, to learn. He said that wisdom begins with admitting your ignorance, and that is still the bravest thing anyone can do today. Because it's so much easier to say, "I'm right," than to whisper, "Maybe I'm wrong." Think about it. In our world, being loud gets you attention. Being certain gets you followers. But being thoughtful, that gets you ignored. Socrates would have been cancelled before he ever got verified. He'd be flagged for spreading discomfort. But that's exactly what real thinking does. It makes you uncomfortable. And that's why we still need him. Because the danger he saw in Athens wasn't just political. It was psychological. When people stop questioning, they stop growing. And when societies stop growing, they start dying. He wasn't afraid of the mob. He was afraid of what the mob becomes when it stops listening. And if you pay attention, that's the world we're living in. A world overflowing with voices, but starving for thought. So, what can we learn from him? Maybe that true democracy isn't about having a vote. It's about having a mind that is awake. It's about the courage to ask, why? even when everyone else says, "Shut up." It's about replacing pride with curiosity and noise with understanding. Because without that, we're just replaying Athens, louder, faster, dumber. And yet, there's hope. Because every time someone stops scrolling, takes a breath and asks, "Wait, is that really true?" Socrates lives again. Every time a student challenges a teacher, or a citizen questions a leader, or someone dares to say, "I don't know, but I want to understand," the gadfly stings the horse once more. That's the legacy. Not the death, not the poison, not the trial, but the courage to think freely, no matter the cost. If Socrates were alive today, he wouldn't tell us to delete our apps or stop arguing online. He'd just smile and say, "Fine, keep talking, but for the love of wisdom, make sure you're listening too." Because the moment we stop questioning, the moment we stop thinking, that's when democracy dies, quietly in our minds. So, the next time you hear someone say, "Everyone has a right to an opinion," remember what Socrates taught us. Sure, but not every opinion deserves to rule. Knowledge must earn its voice, and the first step to wisdom is admitting that maybe, just maybe, we don't have it yet. So what do you think? Was Socrates wrong about democracy, or did he see our future too clearly? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to read them all. And if this story made you think even for a second, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs it. And remember, don't just have opinions, understand them, because that's where freedom really begins.